The soldiers laughed, their voices echoing through the bar. "Nice tattoo, lady. Did you steal it off a real soldier?" one sneered. Keisha's eyes flickered toward them, calm yet razor-sharp. But before she could answer, the room fell quiet, because a colonel had just walked in, and his words would change everything. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening, and the world needs to hear them. The neon lights of Patriots Corner, a bar outside Fort Houston's base, flickered as music hummed low in the background. Keisha sat at the far end, her jacket folded neatly on the stool beside her, a glass of bourbon resting in her hand. She had chosen this bar for its quiet atmosphere, not for confrontation. But quiet never lasted long when arrogance filled the room. 3 young soldiers in uniform slouched around a table nearby. They had been drinking for hours, loud enough that even the bartender rolled his eyes at their crude jokes. One of them, Corporal Chad, spotted the ink that curved across Keisha's forearm, partially visible under her sleeve. "Hey, check that out," he muttered to his friends. "Looks like someone wanted to play soldier." The others burst into laughter. Their voices carried across the bar, pulling unwanted attention toward her. Keisha didn't move. Years of discipline had taught her patience, the kind of patience that made men like Chad even more reckless. "Ma'am," Chad called louder, deliberately mocking the respect that word should carry. "What's that supposed to be? A club tattoo? I've been in the Army 6 years and never seen that design." "You make it up." Keisha's glass touched the counter with a soft clink. Slowly, she turned her head. Her gaze met his, steady, calm, and unflinching. For a moment, Chad hesitated. There was something unsettling in her silence, like a storm gathering behind her eyes. But pride is louder than instinct. He stood, dragging his chair back with a screech, and swaggered toward her. His friends egged him on. "Come on, tell us, lady," he said, now towering over her seat. "That mark on your arm. Is it even real, or did you pick it off Pinterest to impress drunk eyes?" A few nearby veterans shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They recognized something in her composure, something Chad clearly couldn't see. Keisha didn't flinch. She let the silence stretch, let him stew in it. Then, with a voice low enough to hush the entire bar, she said, "You should think very carefully before you insult things you don't understand." The laughter died. The room grew heavier, as though everyone sensed something Chad was too arrogant to notice. And that was when the door opened, the brass insignia of a colonel gleaming as he stepped in, his eyes narrowing immediately at the scene unfolding. The colonel's entrance froze the room for only a moment. He moved toward the far corner with 2 senior sergeants, nodding politely to the bartender, then settled into a booth away from the noise. Conversation in the bar picked up again, though softer this time. For a few beats, it almost felt normal again. Keisha exhaled slowly and returned to her glass. She hadn't wanted attention tonight. Her day job as a logistics supervisor at a civilian contractor's office was exhausting enough. Nights like this, a quiet drink, a corner seat, no questions asked, were her way of staying invisible. But invisibility never lasted long when men like Chad were drinking. At the soldiers' table, Chad smirked as though nothing had happened. "She thinks she's tough," he muttered, pouring the last of his beer into his mouth. "But anyone can flash ink and act mysterious." His friend, Private Ryan, leaned forward with a drunken grin. "I'll bet she's never even seen a base from the inside. Probably some clerk's sister trying to look cool." The third, Specialist Malik, wasn't laughing as hard. His eyes darted back to Keisha, noticing the way she sat. Perfectly still, shoulders squared, posture almost military. He tapped Chad's arm. "Maybe we should chill. Something about her doesn't. Don't get soft." Chad cut him off, waving the thought away. "She's just another poser. Watch me handle this." Across the room, Keisha heard every word. Years of training had sharpened her awareness. She could filter conversations in crowded rooms like sorting files in a cabinet. The insults rolled over her like static, but she felt the tension tighten around the bar. 2 older veterans, seated near the jukebox, exchanged uneasy glances. One wore a Vietnam cap. The other had a faded 82nd Airborne patch stitched onto a jacket. They recognized that kind of stillness, the kind Keisha carried. It wasn't fear. It was restraint. The bartender, polishing glasses with nervous hands, leaned closer to Keisha. "You want me to ask them to back off?" he whispered. Keisha shook her head. "No need. Let them dig their own hole." Her calm voice unsettled him more than anger would have. He stepped away quickly, deciding not to get in the middle. Chad slammed his empty glass down, loud enough to rattle the table. "All right, boys," he said, his voice carrying across the bar. "I'm going to prove this lady's nothing but talk." He pushed himself up and stretched, swaying slightly from the alcohol, then started toward her again. His boots thudded against the wooden floor, each step heavier than the last. Keisha didn't move. She let him approach, her hands resting loosely around her glass, as though she hadn't a care in the world. Inside, though, she felt the shift. The storm was about to break. For now, the calm lingered, but everyone in that bar could sense it wouldn't last much longer. Corporal Chad stopped just a few feet from Keisha's stool, the sour smell of beer clinging to his breath. His voice rose so everyone in the bar could hear. "All right, lady, enough games. You've been sitting there acting like you're better than us. But that tattoo," he jabbed a finger toward her arm, "that doesn't belong to you. I've served long enough to know every unit insignia in this country, and I've never seen that one. So either you're lying or you bought it off some cheap artist downtown." The crowd hushed. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes turned to Keisha. She didn't move. Her hand circled the rim of her glass, eyes fixed on Chad with the kind of still patience that made veterans in the room shift uneasily. "Say something," Chad demanded, his cheeks flushed red. "If you're a real soldier, prove it, or admit you're fake." Private Ryan snickered from the table. She probably worked at the base laundry, got tired of folding fatigues, and thought ink would make her important. Laughter bubbled from their corner, but it was forced, brittle. Even Malik wasn't laughing now. His eyes flicked between Chad and Keisha, unease spreading across his features. Finally, Keisha set her glass down with a gentle tap. Her voice was calm, measured, but it cut through the air like steel. "You should think very carefully before you insult sacrifices you can't even comprehend." Her words didn't carry anger. They carried weight, the kind that silences a room. Chad puffed out his chest, unwilling to back down in front of an audience. "Sacrifices don't try to play that card. I've bled in combat zones. I've lost brothers in firefights. And you," he sneered, leaning closer, "you sit here acting like you've lived it too. You'll make me laugh." The bar tightened with tension. A veteran near the jukebox muttered, "Kid doesn't know what he's walking into." Keisha's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in quiet disappointment. "You think wearing a uniform makes you untouchable. You think stripes on your sleeve give you the right to humiliate strangers. But you don't understand what it means to serve beyond the spotlight." Chad scoffed, spreading his arms wide. "Oh, you enlighten me. Tell us about all the wars you supposedly fought. Tell us where you earned that ink." Keisha shifted slightly on her stool, turned to face him fully now. For the first time, the tattoo on her arm came into full view, an intricate design, sharp lines forming a pattern unlike any Chad had seen. Malik's breath caught. That's not just decoration. Chad ignored him. "Nice trick. Probably Google the design nobody else has. Makes you look mysterious, right?" The bartender set down a glass with shaking hands, unable to look away. Keisha rose slowly from her stool. She was taller than Chad had expected, her frame lean but commanding. When she stood, the air in the bar seemed to shift. Even the colonel in the corner glanced up, watching silently. She stepped closer, her voice lowering so that everyone had to lean in to hear. "You want proof?" she asked softly. "Proof that this mark means something real. You wouldn't survive hearing it. Because the truth lives in places your arrogance could never take you." The silence that followed pressed down like a weight. Chad opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time that night, it was clear Keisha wasn't the one being tested. They were. "If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe." The bar seemed to shrink around them. Every eye tracked Keisha as she rolled her sleeve higher, exposing the tattoo in full. under the dim lights. Its lines and symbols gleamed with precision that spoke of history, not fashion. Chad squinted. What even is that? Looks like some artsy nonsense. Nothing official. Keisha tilted her head slightly. You think so? Her finger traced part of the design. 13 marks, one for each original colony. Wing angles that only those in active combat operations would know. And here, she tapped the smallest detail near her wrist, is a symbol that doesn't exist in your manuals because you've never earned the clearance to see it. A ripple of murmurs moved through the bar. A veteran at the counter muttered, "Damn, she knows the code." Malik leaned forward from his table, his voice uneasy. "Chad, she's not bluffing." But Chad wasn't ready to give ground. His pride burned hotter than reason. Anyone can memorize trivia off the internet. Doesn't prove she served. Doesn't prove she's anything but a fraud with a good memory. Keisha smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had seen arrogance crumble many times before. From her jacket pocket, she slid out a worn photograph. She placed it on the bar between them, her hand resting on the edges like she was presenting evidence in court. The photo showed a small unit of 5 people standing in front of a nondescript building. Their uniforms were unfamiliar, patches unrecognizable. But what caught the eye was the equipment scattered around them, technology that looked too advanced for the year the photo had been taken. Keisha stood at the center, younger, her expression the same calm fire she carried now. "Where was this taken?" Malik whispered, his voice tight. Keisha's eyes didn't leave Chad. "Eastern Province, 2011. Officially, nothing happened there. Officially, we weren't even on the map." The veterans in the room exchanged knowing looks. They had heard of missions that never happened, stories buried under layers of secrecy. Chad forced a laugh, but his voice cracked. "Photoshop, easy trick." That word seemed to shift something in Keisha. Her calm didn't disappear, but it sharpened. "You think I need Photoshop to prove myself?" "No, soldier. I carry proof in scars you'll never see, in friends you'll never meet, because their names aren't written on any wall. And if you had even a fraction of the discipline you pretend to own, you'd know better than to mock what you don't understand." The room was silent again, every patron hanging on her words. Even the colonel in the corner no longer hid his interest. His gaze locked on Keisha, as though confirming a suspicion he'd carried all along. Malik swallowed hard. "Chad, maybe stop." But Chad shook his head violently. "No, she's playing you. She's playing all of us. And I won't be made a fool in front of my own unit." He took another step forward, but now the power in the bar had shifted. Everyone could see it. Keisha wasn't defending herself anymore. She was leading the room. Chad's breath came heavier now, his bravado starting to crack under the weight of the room's silence. Still, he pushed forward, clinging to arrogance like a drowning man to driftwood. "Pictures and stories mean nothing," he barked. "If you were real, someone higher up would back you. But you've got nothing. Just words." Keisha studied him for a moment, then reached calmly into her pocket and pulled out a cell phone. She tapped the screen, her fingers moving with quiet confidence. "What are you doing?" Chad snapped. "Making sure you hear the truth from someone you can't ignore," Keisha replied softly. She lifted the phone to her ear. The bar leaned in, every eye fixed on her. A tense few seconds passed before a voice answered on the other end. Firm, authoritative. "Colonel Mason," she said into the phone, her voice steady. "Yes, it's Keisha. I'm at Patriot's Corner. We seem to have an issue with some soldiers who question my service. Could you clarify a few things?" She held the phone away from her ear, the colonel's voice carrying loudly enough for those nearby to catch fragments. "Carter, you tell them. Absolute respect, highest commendations, more classified than they'll ever know." A murmur rippled through the bar. The veterans nodded knowingly. One of them leaned toward Chad. "Son, if you had any sense, you'd shut your mouth right now." Chad's face paled, but pride held him in place. Ryan shifted uncomfortably at their table, whispering, "Man, this doesn't feel like a bluff anymore." Keisha ended the call with a quiet, "Thank you," and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Her eyes never left Chad. "Still think it's Photoshop?" she asked calmly. Malik swallowed, his voice barely a whisper. "Chad, this isn't a game. She just called a colonel by his first name. Who does that? The tension in the room thickened. Even the bartender's hands shook as he set down another glass. The veterans straightened in their seats, watching Keisha with the kind of respect only earned on battlefields unseen by the public. Chad tried to laugh, but the sound died halfway. He was cornered, and everyone knew it. Keisha stepped closer, her voice dropping so low it was almost a growl. You wanted proof. Now the weight of this entire room knows who I am. The question is, what do you think that means for you? The silence that followed pressed down like a storm cloud, heavy, suffocating. And for the first time that night, Chad had no answer. The heavy squeal of brakes outside shattered the silence. A black SUV and 2 military jeeps pulled up in formation, headlights flooding through the bar's front windows. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Everyone inside knew this wasn't routine. The door swung open with a sharp creak. Colonel Mason strode in, flanked by 2 senior officers in crisp uniforms. His presence carried the weight of decades of command. The room, once filled with arrogance and laughter, fell into a reverent hush. His eyes swept across the bar before locking onto Keisha. A flicker of recognition passed between them, quiet and unspoken. Then Mason's gaze cut to Chad and his friends, sharp enough to slice through steel. Corporal Chad, Private Ryan, Specialist Malik. His voice thundered like a drill field. Stand up, now. The 3 scrambled awkwardly to their feet, knocking chairs over in the process. Chad tried to stand tall, but his confidence had evaporated. Sweat beaded at his temples. Mason stepped closer, his tone lowering into something even more dangerous. Do you have any idea who you've been disrespecting tonight? Chad stammered. Yes, sir, we didn't know. Silence. Mason snapped. The word hit the room like a whip crack. Ignorance is no excuse for arrogance. He turned to Keisha. For a moment, the colonel's rigid frame softened. He brought his hand to his forehead and delivered a precise salute. Ms. Carter, he said with measured respect. It's an honor. Gasps rippled across the room. Soldiers, veterans, even the bartender stood straighter. Keisha returned the gesture with a small nod, calm as ever. Mason faced the 3 young men again, his voice cold and unforgiving. You mocked a woman whose service record will never appear in your textbooks. You questioned a sacrifice you will never be able to measure. Do you know what that tattoo represents? None of them dared answer. Mason's gaze hardened. 5 missions, each one classified beyond your clearance. Each one altering the course of conflicts you will only read about in sanitized reports. And she was there for all of them, while you were learning how to salute properly. Keisha was keeping this country alive in shadows you'll never even step into. The silence was suffocating. Ryan swallowed hard. Malik's hands trembled at his sides. Chad stared at the floor, his pride shattered. Mason stepped back, voice carrying across the entire bar. Effective immediately, you 3 are suspended from all duties pending review. Your arrogance has no place in the uniform you wear. The word struck like a hammer. Chad opened his mouth to plead, but Mason raised a hand, cut him off before a single word could escape. This isn't about punishment, Mason continued. It's about humility. You will report to a new training program, one under the guidance of the very woman you tried to humiliate tonight. The room erupted in whispers. The irony was as sharp as a blade. Keisha finally broke her silence, her voice calm but firm. They don't need punishment, Colonel. They need perspective. Let them learn what respect really means. Her words hung in the air, heavier than any threat could have been. Mason gave a curt nod. As you wish. For the first time, Chad dared to glance up at her. There was no mockery left in his eyes, only the sinking realization that he had underestimated the wrong person. 6 months later, the training grounds at Fort Houston looked different. The program was harsher, stricter, and unlike anything the young soldiers had faced before. And at its core stood Keisha, not with stripes or medals, but with the authority of someone who had already proven herself where it mattered most. Chad woke at 4:30 a.m. daily, dragging himself through mud runs, tactical drills, and lectures on discipline. The arrogance he once wore like armor had been stripped away. For the first time in his career, he listened more than he spoke. Ryan, who once laughed the loudest, now carried notebooks filled with lessons Keisha drilled into them about respect, about restraint, about the cost of ignorance. Malik, always uneasy but silent, found his voice in the program, often defending newer recruits from the same kind of arrogance he once stood by and watched. Keisha never raised her voice unnecessarily. She didn't need to. Her authority was in her presence, in the way she carried herself, in the knowledge she passed down, in the calm fire that reminded every trainee she had walked paths they couldn't even imagine. One afternoon, after an exhausting obstacle course, Keisha called the three men forward. They stood before her, drenched in sweat, breathing hard but refusing to look away. "Tell me," she asked evenly, "what is the difference between strength and respect?" Chad answered, his tone steady but humble. "Strength is what you show on the field. Respect is what you earn by how you treat others." For the first time, Keisha smiled openly. "Good. Remember that. Because the world doesn't fall because of lack of muscles. It falls when men forget respect." The program spread across bases nationwide, reshaping how soldiers were trained in humility and cultural awareness. Veterans whispered Keisha's name with admiration, and recruits repeated her lessons like scripture. At Patriots Corner, the bar where it all began, a small plaque hung proudly, dedicated to Keisha, proof that respect is the true measure of strength. And when people asked Chad what he'd learned from those months, his answer was always the same: "The greatest mistake I ever made was underestimating her. The greatest gift I ever received was the chance to learn from her." The laughter that once mocked her tattoo was long gone. In its place was silence, the kind that carried respect. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.